All right, today we're going to be going over the top 10 grunge albums. And I think Loudwire put this list together. Some of it I think is very fair. They did a pretty good job of compiling a lot of it. But then I'd say quite a few of the bands and albums on there probably aren't where they should be. But I'm going to start actually with number 11, because I think number 11 deserves an honorable mention. We've got Nirvana's Bleach from 1989. 2 years before they single-handedly turned the music world on its ear with Nevermind, Nirvana made their modest full-length debut with Bleach, which was recorded by Jack Endino for the sum of $600 over 30 hours. As we know, Nirvana went through quite a few drummers. They had their first drummer was Aaron Burkhardt from 1987 to 1987. He didn't have a very long run there. He recorded to With the Lights Out. It looks like that was really the only song he was ever really recorded on. Dave Foster, though, was from 1988 to 1988, another really long stretch there. He was the second drummer. He only did a few live performances. He was never actually, with the band for very long at all. Chad Channing. Chad Channing was the one who came up with the $600. He was the... Wait. Was it Chad Channing or Dan Peters? I'm pretty sure it was Chad Channing. Chad Channing was actually the guy who came up with the money for the Bleach album. He was the only one who had a serious job at the time, so he actually fronted most of the money for that album, which was $600, which is crazy. They recorded Bleach for $600. It still kind of holds up. It's a little rough and probably isn't for all listeners. I think a lot of people probably won't really enjoy it as much as they should. But, music is subjective. There's a different sound for everybody, and Bleach is a little bit rough around the edges, which I'm fine with, but a lot of people who haven't heard it might not like it. Anyway, getting onto the list, the top 10 grunge albums of the 90s. We have number 10, Stone Temple Pilots with the album Purple. Apparently, no band had to cope with a worse rap in the grunge era than San Diego-based Stone Temple Pilots. Rather unfairly, they say. I don't agree. I don't think Stone Temple Pilots was that great. Scott Weiland was a perfectly good singer. He was a great songwriter. It just wasn't that original, if you ask me. He seemed to be kind of copying off a lot of the others. Like 1994, that was already 5 years after Bleach. 4 years after. That's 4 years after Alice in Chains' Facelift. 3 years after Temple of the Dogs. So they weren't that original. They kind of came out of nowhere and just were copying people, and they weren't even from Seattle. So I don't really think you can be fairly a part of the Seattle sound, which was grunge, without being from Seattle. You know what I mean? That's like making country music and being from New York City. That just doesn't really work. So I don't know. I don't think number 10 should be Purple. I think there's better options that could be at number 10, and Stone Temple doesn't really deserve to be in the top 10. They can be in the top 30, I'll give them that, but I don't think they should be in number 10. That's too high up on the list. But I think they just put them on the list probably for a little bit of diversity. You know what I mean? Because if it's all the same four bands, which you'll see, it's pretty much all the same four bands, and you probably already know. And if you know anything about grunge and the 90s music, you probably already know which four bands are at the top. And then we got Temple the Dog at number 9. Temple the Dog is great. That was a supergroup, a grunge supergroup with Eddie Vedder and Chris Cornell, Soundgarden and Pearl Jam. Yeah, so the total band listing for Temple the Dog was Chris Cornell, Stone Gossard, Jeff Ament, which is also from Pearl Jam, Matt Cameron, Mike McCready, and then a little-known guest singer named Eddie Vedder. I wonder who that Eddie Vedder guy is. I wonder if he's any good. But yeah, Temple the Dog came out in 1991, which is kind of weird if you think about it, because now it's considered a supergroup because it had the two big names, Eddie Vedder and Chris Cornell. But at the time, it was kind of just a pet project. They weren't a supergroup. In 1991, as they say, Eddie Vedder was a little-known singer who is now, Eddie Vedder's huge. He's one of the biggest rock singers of all time. So that's pretty impressive, honestly. It's a pretty cool little piece of history there. The fact that they got together that early and put something out so good. Temple the Dog, the song Hunger Strike, ended up going to number 5 in the U.S. charts. With the passing of Mother Love Bone singer Andrew Wood, they put out a single, which was Hunger Strike, and then they turned it into an EP, and then it became an album. And 25 years later after the album, it became a full-fledged tour. Wow, that's big news there. The album ended up going to number 5 and went platinum, multi-times platinum. I'm not sure how many times platinum, but it went multi-platinum. Number 8 is Facelift by Alice in Chains from 1990, and that was an early one. Facelift ended up being a nationally successful album. Before being ordained as one of grunge's big four bands, Alice in Chains enjoyed a fair amount of exposure and acclaim as a promising heavy metal band, as proven by their proper participation in the Clash of the Titans tour, opening for Anthrax, Megadeth, and Slayer. And why not, since Alice in Chains' powerful debut album, Facelift, arrived all of 1 year prior to Nevermind. We should call this period BN. That's kind of quirky. We should call this period BN, before Nevermind, and immediately connected with adventurous headbangers seeking solace and alternatives from the dreaded dominance of hair metal, out of which AIC, Alice in Chains, ironically involved. Millions of grunge disciples would soon adopt the band, no questions asked. I think it's a good album. Facelift definitely wasn't Alice in Chains' best album, but it's up there. I mean, it's a great album. Still stands up today. And that really was. If you go back and look at some really old, you can probably find it here on YouTube. If you go back and look at some really old Alice in Chains stuff, you can find them with their big poofy hair and their high-pitched vocals. I'm pretty glad they stopped doing that, to be honest. That's no good. Moving on to number 7. On Casey Kasem. Number 7. Soundgarden, Bad Motor Finger. 1991. It's a good album. Soundgarden never did anything bad. It says here, first to the table, last to feast. Soundgarden completed the quadfecta, yep, that's a word, of Seattle's grunge platinum selling Big Four with 1991's monumental Bad Motor Finger, one of genre's most eclectic excursions, bar none. Its songs ranged from easily digestible, in parentheses, Rusty Cage and Outshined, to angular, challenging fare, Jesus Christ pose, and protracted sludge fests, searching with my good eye closed, to frantic punk rockers, drawing flies, from devastating doom metal, Room 1,000 Years Wide, to subdued meditations, Mind Riot. Along the way, Bad Motor Finger expanded grunge's musical lexicon, no end, blowing minds and taking names in its wake. To be perfectly honest, I don't think I know any songs off of Bad Motor Finger. That's probably my bad. And here we are to Nirvana, In Utero. You know they'd be on the list. Did you think they'd be number 6, though? Nirvana's In Utero is number 6. Which I don't think that's fair, actually. I think that In Utero should actually be quite a bit higher up on the list, if you know what I mean. That album was great. It was just, 100% one of the best albums ever made, and it holds up to this day. Very few skips. There might be only 1 or 2 skips on that album. Anyway, let me read this. Nirvana leader Kurt Cobain never fully processed the unimaginable success of Nevermind, and his band's third and final studio album, In Utero, ultimately reflected the confusion in songs that alternately tried to scare off the trio's pop audience. Soundless Apprentice, Milk It, Radio-Friendly Unit Shifter. Radio-Friendly Unit Shifter. Ugh. Try and say that fast. Ugh. And those are kind of the songs that aren't that great. I mean, Milk It's good. Radio-Friendly Unit Shifter, though, I never find myself listening to that song all the way through. When I'm listening to In Utero, I usually skip it. Radio-Friendly Unit Shifter, just because I like to be able to sing along, and I don't know that song well enough to be able to sing along. So, In Utero ultimately reflected this confusion in songs that alternately tried to scare off the trio's pop audience. Soundless Apprentice, Milk It, Radio-Friendly Unit Shifter, and welcomed them back with Open Arms, Heart-Shaped Box, Penny Royalty, and All Apologies. Big hits, yeah. Although, I'd like to know which one you like better. Out of Heart-Shaped Box, Penny Royalty, and All Apologies, which one do you like better? I kind of like Penny Royalty now. Heart-Shaped Box has always been one of my favorites, but Penny Royalty's been growing on me lately, just because I've listened to all the others so much that it's nice to have something fresh. Plus, Penny Royalty on Unplugged, live in New York, it's just a phenomenal album. Unplugged is great, and Penny Royalty on that is absolutely great. Side note, did you know that Penny Royalty is actually toxic? Pennyroyal is toxic in large amounts. It can cause liver failure. Fun fact. Sadly, neither scenario could save Cobain from his personal demons, and this final work's undeniable genius remains unfortunately overshadowed by his subsequent passing in April of 1994, less than a year after In Utero's release. Pearl Jam versus 1993. Pearl Jam 2 had to contend with traumatizing personal repercussions of global grunge stardom. Their response was to rage against the machine, so to speak, by refusing to produce music videos for MTV, passing themselves as Neil Young's backing band, and later picking a fight with Ticketmaster. which is pretty base nowadays. I think everybody should pick a fight with Ticketmaster. Speaking of which, Elon, if you're watching this, please, please, please make an opponent to Ticketmaster. I know everybody hates Elon now, and I don't really care one way or the other about him, but somebody needs to create an opponent to Ticketmaster, because that's really kind of BS. The stranglehold that they have on the market, it'd be pretty cool if somebody could come along and fix that. Anyway. But in 1993, they channeled all of these festering emotions and their considerable talents into the phenomenal Verses, arguably their best effort, pound for pound, and just brimming with stellar material like Animal, Daughter, Rearview Mirror, and Elderly Woman. I agree. That's a great album. When I was younger, I didn't really personally care for Pearl Jam, but, now as we mature and get better tastes, I like it. I think Eddie Vedder was a great vocalist. And he was traditionally, and plus I can almost sing along with Eddie Vedder. Daddy didn't give affection. Number 4, Soundgarden, Super Unknown, 1994 as well. 1994 was a good year. That was the year I was born. A lot of good stuff happened that year. After proving they could move millions of copies on their own terms with Bad Motor Finger, Soundgarden proved they could streamline their thorny, inimitable songwriting just enough to do it again on an even larger scale with the stunning Super Unknown. Sacrificing none of their mold-shattering individuality, the quartet simply fine-tuned virtually every song here. My Wave, Fell on Black Days, Fell on... the title track into a potential single, and the tunes that were actually chosen as official singles, primarily The Spoon Man and Psychedelic Nightmare. Black Hole Sun went on to define the grunge era, even as it neared its conclusion and fell on black days of its own making. Soundgarden, Super Unknown, that's the one with most of the songs I know. I mentioned earlier that I didn't know a lot of songs on Bad Motor Finger, but yeah, Super Unknown. Excellent album. Black Hole Sun is one of the best songs of the 90s in my opinion. Number 3 is Pearl Jam's 10 from 1991, which is a great album. I like almost every song on 10. It's pretty much a no-skip album, and it really shows Eddie Vedder's singing range, and that's... Plus, I was noticing the other day when I was listening to a few of those songs that his pattern and the way that his cadence is and the way he speaks and the way he enunciates things is not really in a pattern at all. It's just like stream consciousness almost sometimes, which is something really unique about grunge that I think we kind of lost in music as a whole, is everything today has a conducive flow, you know what I mean? Like, and a clear topic, whereas grunge, kind of confusing. If you go and read the lyrics, you won't know exactly what they're talking about, which gives you the opportunity to infer meaning and relate it to your own life, which is what, is beautiful about art in general. So it would be nice if we could bring that back. Bring that back, artists. Pearl Jam 10. According to some troublemaking observers, Pearl Jam crashed the grunge party thrown by Nirvana with rather more classic rock steeped, as opposed to punk-based, sound of 1991's Diamond Certified 10. But there's no disputing the fact that the group composed of former Green River and Mother Love Bone members, Gossard and Ament, had more than earned its Seattle birthright. What's more, now classic songs like Even Flow, all released 1 month prior to Nevermind, incidentally, did just as much to codify grunge's signature sound among the masses as Kurt's creations, making Pearl Jam's magnum opus a worthy cornerstone of alternative rock's rising tide. 10 is a great album. I think 3 is where that belongs. Here's where it's going to get controversial in my opinion. This one's awful. I'll get more into it in a minute. Number two most influential grunge album of all time. Nirvana's Nevermind from 1991. Everybody knows it. I'll read what they put here. Nevermind ranks among the greatest rock records of all time, but it also bears mentioning that Nirvana's sophomore opus catalyzed a musical and cultural revolution like no other work of popular music short of the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper. A perfect storm of raw power and melodic sensitivity, Nevermind and its complement of immortal tunes led by Smells Like Teen Spirit basically claimed rock and roll back for its original intended audience, disenfranchised youth. 35 years after Elvis set the example, in doing so it created a reluctant living legend out of the bandleader Curtis Cobain, with bassist Chris Novoselic and drummer Dave Grohl not far behind, and turned the strange term grunge into a household word. And they put Alice in Chains' Dirt as number 1. I'll read what they said before I get into it. Alice in Chains' Dirt, 1992. If the public at large still remained oblivious to the grunge community's pervasive drug abuse, then Alice in Chains went ahead and told them all about it on 1992's Dirt. Undisguised examples of Sickman, Junkhead, Godsmack, and Angry Chair were terrifying and mesmerizing in equal measures. Side note, Godsmack the band totally ripped off Alice in Chains in many, many ways. For one, they got their name from an Alice in Chains song. And then he went on, the lead singer of Godsmack went on to try and just basically steal Lane Staley's singing style. So I don't have very much respect for Godsmack. It's not very original. I didn't realize that as a kid. I grew up with Godsmack on the radio and Pearl Jam, and I just thought all music kind of sounded the same from that period, like early 2000s. The music from the early 2000s, everything kind of sounds similar, except for like the post-punk stuff. But a lot of like the post-grunge stuff is all just kind of trying to rip off Alice in Chains, Pearl Jam, and Nirvana. Similarly gloomy issues like depression, war, and mortality pervaded other key tracks like Them Bones, Rooster, and Wood, all of which might have made AIC's sophomore album a downer and a slump, if not for the haunting beauty of Cantrell and Staley's vocal harmonies and the musical exorcism of their demons. I'm not going to disagree that Alice in Chains' Dirt is a great album, because it is. I love Alice in Chains. I think they're great. Definitely should be number 2. But for you to put Alice in Chains' Dirt over Nevermind, even if you don't like Nirvana, you can't say that Dirt was a better album, because Nevermind sold twice as many. Dirt was 5 times platinum, which is great. That's a very successful album. No complaints there. However, Nevermind was 10 times platinum, went to 300,000 sales in just the first week alone, and bumped Michael Jackson off of the charts for the number 1 spot, which was something that didn't happen a lot back then. So I tell you what, Nevermind is 100% the number 1 grunge album of all time. Not only was it so successful at the time, but it is still a successful album today. Kids know Nevermind. It doesn't matter how old you are, you know Smells Like Teen Spirit. Everybody knows who Kurt Cobain is. Everybody probably knows who Alice in Chains is. Actually, I wouldn't be surprised to find out that a lot of kids don't know who Alice in Chains is. They've probably heard the songs from Alice in Chains. They've probably heard Lane Staley's voice, but I would not be surprised to learn that a lot of kids don't know who Lane Staley is and don't know who Alice in Chains is. So yeah, 100%, Nevermind should be the number 1 grunge album. I also think that In Utero should be a little bit higher up on the list, because it didn't sell as good as Nevermind. It's up to opinion. You can think it's better all you want, but looking at the numbers, it did not sell as well as Nevermind initially. It sold a lot afterwards, but Nevermind has more hits than any album on this list. It was certified platinum more than any album on this list. So why would it be number 2? That makes no sense. That's just bias on your part, Loudwire. I expect an apology. I want a written apology, because Nirvana should be at number 1 with Nevermind. That's not even my bias. I'll admit, I'm a huge Nirvana fan. They're one of my favorite bands of all time, even 30 years later. I mean, a lot of this was 30 years ago. Nevermind came out in 1991, so 32 years now. That's a long time, and it's still culturally relevant. I mean, you're still getting controversy over the baby picture on the front. Still to this day, 30 years later, people are still controversial about that. The songs, most people know 3 or 4 songs. Even if you've never listened to Nirvana before willingly, you've never gone and got one of their albums, never looked them up, even if you've never done that, I guarantee you've heard 3 or 4 of their songs. I bet you your 90-year-old grandmother knows It Smells Like Teen Spirit. Whereas I doubt it. Your average 90-year-old grandmother probably does not know Them Bones. I'm sorry, but Nirvana is by far the number 1 most influential grunge band, if not in the top 10 most influential bands of the last 50 years. Because since the Beatles, we haven't had a whole lot. We've had a few, flash in the pan successes and stuff overnight, but nothing was quite as big as Nirvana was. And I don't know if we ever will again. We've had some stuff that comes close since then. Eminem was a big one back in the early 2000s. People were obsessed with Eminem, just like they were obsessed with Nirvana. People went out and tried to bleach their hair like Marshall. People went out and bought all of his albums and got baggy pants and, these Adidas shirts. Adidas shirts had nothing to do with him. What am I thinking of? There's tracksuits. There's goofy tracksuits and the goofy hats. Everybody went out to try and dress like Eminem back in the early 2000s, but they did the same thing in the 90s, and it was actually more of a widespread trend. A wider spreaded trend was Nirvana, because everybody was wearing flannels, and that started with Kurt. that started with Nirvana, was the flannels, with the grunge scene. If it weren't for Nevermind, I don't think half of these albums on here would be on here. They would not be as big as they were. It wouldn't have been as culturally significant as it was. But because of Smells Like Teen Spirit, which isn't even their best song, but it's their, their most popular, and we're basing this on trying to be impartial. I like Nirvana, but I'm trying to see from a business perspective and from a cultural perspective. Nirvana's Nevermind was far more significant than any album on here, and a lot of these guys owe a lot of success to the success of Nevermind, because that put the spotlight on Seattle at the time and the music that they were doing. Alright, so Nevermind aside, we've established that Nevermind should be number one. Alright, we're all in agreement. I already know we are. There's no need to leave comments, because I know we all agree that Nevermind should be number one. But the rest of the list, let's see. I think that Dirt should be number two. I have no problem with it. I think it's a great album, but it only sold half as much as Nevermind. I said beyond Nevermind. I gotta get past that. So if I did my list, it would be number one, Nevermind. Number two, Dirt. What would we put as number three? I think Pearl Jam 10 deserves to be at 3. That's where it is on this list, so I think they were right about that. Pearl Jam 10 is a great album. And I think Super Unknown by Soundgarden also deserves to be number 4. I would say that Super Unknown from Soundgarden and 10 are tied neck and neck for the top spot with number 3. Because I almost think that Soundgarden's Super Unknown is slightly better than Pearl Jam's 10. But I think that's more of a matter of opinion. I'd have to look it up real quick. Let's see. Super Unknown sold 310,000 copies in its opening week, just like Nevermind did. So, I'm sorry, but I think Super Unknown should be a little bit above Pearl Jam, just based on selling. Because, come on, Black Hole Sun is still a great song. That was a great song. The music video is trippy as hell. If you haven't seen that music video, go check it out. I'm sure anybody watching this has probably seen it. But if you haven't, it was certified 6 times platinum by the RAA. I don't know what that stands for. The Record Initiative of America for Americans. I'm going to assume that's what it is. The Record Initiative of America for Americans certified it 6 times platinum. You can't tell me that's not a success. Pearl Jam 10 was not even an immediate success, which isn't a great metric because, again, Pearl Jam 10 came out in 1991, before Nevermind, if I remember correctly. Nevermind came out before 10 did. Yeah. Nevermind came out a month after Pearl Jam's 10 did, and immediately sold 300,000 copies in the first week, which is crazy for an unknown genre, although it was basically just rock and roll. Everybody likes rock and roll. I don't think that 10 was as culturally significant as Super Unknown from Soundgarden was, so I think I'd actually have to give Soundgarden the number 3 spot for Super Unknown. Super Unknown should be the number 3 spot, and Pearl Jam 10 would have to be number 4, simply because just of immediate success and I think lasting power. I'm not saying that Pearl Jam 10 hasn't lasted. 10 is a great album, has a lot of great songs. But Black Hole Sun still gets played at like basketball games and stuff. So I think that it deserves the number 3 spot. Super Unknown gets the number 3 spot in my opinion. Number 4 is going to be 10. I'm fine with Pearl Jam Versus. Actually, no, I'd move In Utero up to number 5 and bump Pearl Jam Versus to number 6, because I think In Utero is a great album. And it sold a lot. It sold so many albums. I think I'd leave the rest of the list, except I'd bump Temple the Dog. Not Temple the Dog. I'd bump Stone Temple Pilots from number 10 and move up one of these other bands. Not Hole. If Mother Love Bone, it's not really culturally significant anymore. So Mother Love Bone, I mean, it was good for the time, but by today's standard, Mother Love Bone's album, which was number 13 for Apple from 1990, I think I'd leave that in the bottom part. The one I think I would move up, now I'm not a Melvins fan, but Melvins Houdini wouldn't, without Melvins Houdini album, well, that album came out after Nevermind, but without the Melvins in general, Nirvana probably wouldn't be here, because Kurt learned a lot from Buzz Osborne from the Melvins. So I would bump up as an honorable mention and bump Stone Temple Pilots from the number 10 spot and move the Melvins. I'll just move them as a whole to number 10. So my list, instead of the Loudwire's list, my list would be number 1. The only thing that makes sense at number 1 is Nevermind. Any list that doesn't have Nevermind at the number 1 grunge album is a lie, and they need to apologize. Number 2 would be Dirt from Alice in Chains. Number 3 would be Super Unknown, bumping Pearl Jam's 10 to number 4. Number 5, I would bump down to number 6. And number 5 would be In Utero by Nirvana. And then number 6 would be Pearl Jam Versus. Alice in Chains Facelift is fine. Temple the Dog, I think I might bump Temple the Dog from number 9 up to number 8. And then bump Alice in Chains Facelift down to number 9. And then number 10, I just move whatever Melvin's album on. Houdini was a good album, but it came out after Nirvana. So I think the Melvins deserve an honorable mention simply for the role they played in creating the number 1 most influential grunge album, Nevermind. Honestly, I think I would bump Facelift off the list entirely. Alice in Chains Facelift, I want to bump that off the list and replace it with Jar of Flies, because there are no hit songs that we still really listen to today off of Facelift. So I think I would just take Facelift off. I know the reason they put it on the list was because it was an early album and it was influential because it was an early album, but it didn't even really take off until later. Everything took off. A lot of this stuff took off years after it was already popular. So I would bump Facelift and replace it with Jar of Flies.